Imagine being the most wanted man in Africa, heavily guarded, living right next door to the president, and at 3 a.m. in the morning, your house begins to explode around you. How do you escape? Through the toilet window, of course. That is the story of Operation Bastille, and the attackers are the Rhodesian Special Air Service. I'm John Mason, and welcome back to the Warroom Library. Today, the book we are going to be reviewing is called The Elite by Barbara Cole. It tells the story of the Rhodesian Special Air Service, a special forces unit from a country that no longer exists. Now, I actually know Barbara Cole personally, and over the years, I've briefly met one or two of the men featured in this book. Only briefly and only in passing, but enough to know these stories are real. This isn't one of those polished war books where everyone comes out looking perfect. It's honest about the missions, the fear, the pressure, and the cost of fighting a long war that most of the world had already decided you were going to lose. So where does it all begin? The unit was born from the original British SAS, formed during World War II, and hardened in the jungles of Malaya. The Rhodesian SAS returned to Africa with a reputation for patience, tracking, survival that would soon be tested in one of the most brutal bush wars of the Cold War. What made the Rhodesian SAS different wasn't just the operations, it was the selection process, because not everyone made it through. The standards were notoriously hard. Physically, yes, but mentally even more so. The instructors were looking for something very specific. Men who could stay calm when exhausted, men who could keep functioning when hungry, wet, frightened, and isolated. Because small team operations deep in the bush leave nowhere to hide weaknesses, and the bush itself became part of the selection. Heat, distance, weight, sleep deprivation, the constant pressure slowly stripped people down to who they really were. Some quit, some broke psychologically, some simply realized they weren't suited to this kind of warfare. But the men who remained developed an almost frightening level of self-reliance. And once you understand what the bush demand of these men was, the operations later in this book suddenly feel a lot less like action stories and a lot more like survival. By the late 1960s, Rhodesia was fighting a guerrilla war. Two armed movements, ZANLA and ZIPRA, were trying to overthrow the current government at the time. ZANLA stood for the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, and ZIPRA was the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army. One was largely backed by China, the other by the Soviet Union. So this wasn't just a local conflict anymore. The Cold War had arrived in Africa. Most of the guerrilla fighters carried AK-47s, rugged, reliable rifles supplied through Soviet and Chinese support networks. The Rhodesian SAS, meanwhile, largely carried the FN FAL, known in British service as the SLR rifle. It was heavier, longer ranged, more powerful. I actually used an SLR myself briefly during my time in the South African Navy. So whenever Barbara Cole mentions those rifles, I can instantly picture them. The weight, the sound, the feel of carrying one. And something else really stayed with me, speaking to some of the former SAS operatives over the years. They talked about sound, not just gunfire, but mechanical sounds. You know, the metallic cocking noise of the AK-47 somewhere out in the darkness could put an entire patrol on instant alert. Because in the bush, at night, sound carries differently, and men who survive long enough in that environment develop an almost frightening awareness of tiny noises most people would never even notice. The Rhodesian military was small. The SAS was tiny in comparison to that even, but they understood something important. In a guerrilla war, if you stay defensive, you lose the initiative. You spend your whole time reacting, always one step behind. So the SAS decided to do the complete opposite. Cross-border operations began in Mozambique, Zambia, Botswana, and these were targeted towards training camps, supply routes, and guerrilla bases. All were suddenly no longer safe. Officially, Rhodesian soldiers were never supposed to be there, and if something went wrong, nobody was coming to rescue them. Barbara Cole explains what these operations actually felt like. A typical mission might involve just 4 or 5 men crossing a border at night on foot, carrying everything they needed to survive. Days would be spent moving through the bush, watching enemy routes, and studying movement patterns. Eventually came the selection of the ambush site, the killing ground, and that choice mattered a lot. You needed cover, good fields of fire, a clean escape route, and then came the hardest part, waiting. Not for minutes, sometimes an entire day, completely still. Insects crawling across your face, heat pressing down on you, but eventually you would hear voices, footsteps, movement. Everything suddenly becomes very real. The ambush itself happens fast, violent, controlled, precise, and within moments the team disappears back into the bush. By the time anyone responds, they've gone. What makes this book really special is the access that Barbara Cole had to these men. She earned their trust, sat with them personally, listened carefully, and many shared stories they had never spoken about publicly before. But one mission towers above the rest. It's Operation Bastille, April 1979. This is the one I spoke to you earlier about at the beginning. The target was Joshua Nkomo. Now, Nkomo was the leader of ZIPRA and one of the most important political figures in the region. He was heavily protected and living in Lusaka at the time. Lusaka was the capital of Zambia. Not hidden in the bush, not near the border. It was a major city with guards, security, and the presidential residence really close by. The SAS thought they would go on the offensive, and they decided to hit the target anyway. 42 men, 7 Land Rovers. The vehicles were disguised as Zambian military vehicles, complete with markings and paint. The team crossed Lake Kariba at night by ferry, then drove more than 200 kilometers into Zambia, through towns, past checkpoints, and one detail in the story always makes me smile. When they reached Lusaka, they stopped at the red traffic lights. Now think about that for a moment. 42 Rhodesian SAS soldiers deep inside enemy territory, stopping politely at the traffic lights, because speeding through the city at night would attract attention. That level of nerve is difficult to comprehend. The attack itself was fast and violent. The security was overwhelming. The house was badly damaged, but Nkomo escaped. Now, Nkomo was apparently quite a large man, and afterwards, when journalists asked him how he managed to get out, he said he escaped through the toilet window. And when the Rhodesian commanders heard that story, they reportedly burst out laughing, probably the only time they'd laughed in a while. However, in true SAS style, after the mission, they climbed back into their Land Rovers and drove out of Lusaka and made it home safely. Meanwhile, just down the road, the Zambian president was hosting hundreds of international delegates at a conference. That gives you the idea of how bold this operation really was. And although this mission didn't eliminate Nkomo, the psychological effect was enormous. Apparently, he never slept in the same residence twice afterwards. What really stayed with me after reading this book was the professionalism of these soldiers. But the standards they maintained were exceptionally high. The unit was adaptable, disciplined, creative under pressure, and at the same time, Barbara Cole doesn't pretend that the war was glamorous. She writes about the funerals, the exhaustion, the emotional toll it took on these men, and also these men understood the political situation around them. Britain had turned against Rhodesia and sanctions had been imposed. International pressure was building. And they knew all of that, but they still carried on fighting because they believed in the men that they were fighting beside. And honestly, that bond between soldiers is one of the strongest themes in the entire book. The war ended in 1980, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, and the regiment was disbanded. The final farewell included a parachute display using Dakota aircraft, the same aircraft many of these men had jumped from during the war. Now there's a famous story about this final parade. As the aircraft took off and passed off overhead, apparently the men decided to give the British SAS a farewell salute. But this wasn't a normal salute. It was not an official military salute because they all dropped their trousers as the plane took off. So honestly, it's exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from these soldiers. After the regiment disappeared, the men scattered across the world. Some went to South Africa, some to Britain, some drifted into other wars and conflicts. But with this book, Barbara Cole has preserved their stories before they disappeared with time. And that really matters, because without books like this, entire chapters of history vanish. The unofficial operations, the hidden missions, the men nobody publicly talks about anymore. The elite keeps at least some of that alive. So if you're interested in Special Forces history, if you're interested in the Cold War throughout Africa, or simply stories about ordinary men under extraordinary pressure, this book is absolutely worth reading. With the age of the book, I would say it can be difficult to find a copy at the moment. But if you ever see one, absolutely grab it. And if you've read The Elite or know anything about this period of history, let me know in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. I'm John Mason, and you've been watching the Warroom Library.